The letter crinkled in Maggie Whitaker's fist as she stood in the middle of the Coldwater Creek General Store, her eyes locked on the man who was supposed to need her. He was not supposed to look like that. He was not supposed to have shoulders that filled a doorframe or hands that looked like they had been carved from the same dark oak as the counter he leaned against. He was not supposed to have a jaw that could cut glass or eyes the color of a Colorado sky just before a storm rolled in and swallowed the sun whole. He was not supposed to look at her the way he was looking at her right now, steady, patient, unreadable, as though she were a riddle he had already solved and was simply waiting for her to catch up. "You are Clark Haskins," Maggie said, and it came out less like a greeting and more like an accusation. "I am," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, like a river that knew exactly where it was going. Maggie's throat tightened. She looked down at the letter in her hand, at the careful, looping handwriting that her cousin Dora had shown her back in St. Louis, at the words that had convinced her to pack 2 trunks, board a train, and ride a stagecoach across 300 miles of dust and rattlesnake country to arrive in this tiny, sun-scorched town in the Colorado Territory in the summer of 1882. The letter had said, "A quiet man, a steady man, a rancher who had built something from nothing and found himself overwhelmed by the paperwork, the bookkeeping, the household management that came with running a modest operation. A man who had written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis and asked, with what Maggie had interpreted as touching humility, for a woman who knew how to manage things. Maggie knew how to manage things. Maggie had been managing things since she was 12 years old and her father had taken to the bottle and left her mother with 6 younger siblings and a leaking roof. Maggie had managed the household accounts, the dry goods budget, the social calendar, the temperaments of difficult men and weeping women with equal efficiency. She had arrived in Coldwater Creek with a leather-bound ledger under one arm and a very clear picture in her mind of what Clark Haskins was going to be. He was going to be small. Not necessarily in body, though she had imagined something slight. He was going to be small in confidence, uncertain, the kind of man who drifted through his own life and needed someone like Maggie to give it shape and direction. She had felt, she was ashamed to admit even to herself, something close to relief at that prospect. She had been managing difficult things for 26 years. The idea of managing something soft, something willing, had felt like a reward. What stood before her now was not soft. What stood before her now was the most self-possessed man she had ever encountered in her life, and he was looking at her with those storm-colored eyes, and she felt the first terrible suspicion unfurl in her chest like a dark flower opening. She had not come here to be managed, and yet, she took one breath, then another, gripped her leather ledger tighter and said, "Your letter described a man who needed help running his ranch. I'm here to provide that help. I would like to review the operations accounts before supper." Clark Haskins studied her for one long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something quieter than that, something that made her stomach do a thing she absolutely refused to acknowledge. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I figured you would." And that was the moment, though Maggie Whitaker would not have admitted it to a living soul, that something in her world shifted off its axis and refused to go back. The story of how they had gotten here began the way most stories in the Colorado Territory began in the summer of 1882, with desperation dressed up as practicality. Maggie had been living in St. Louis for 4 years, working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Aldous Fenn, who was 62 and smelled of camphor, and who had proposed to her twice and been refused twice, and had recently begun making it clear, in the small and cutting ways that men with small power tend to do, that her position was becoming uncomfortable. She was not afraid of Aldous Fenn. But she was tired of him, tired of the city, tired of the particular kind of trapped feeling that came from being a competent woman in a world that only valued competence in women when it came attached to submission. Her cousin Dora had shown her the matrimonial agency advertisement in the back of a gazette. Women of good character sought for Western positions, domestic arrangement, partnership possibility. It had sounded transactional. Maggie liked transactional. She had written to the agency and they had sent her 3 profiles. 2 of them were farmers in Kansas whose letters contained more discussion of their livestock than of themselves. The third was Clark Haskins of Coldwater Creek, Colorado Territory. His letter had been short and plain-spoken. He ran the Haskins Ranch, approximately 400 acres running along the eastern fork of Coldwater Creek. He had a modest operation: beef cattle, some horses, 2 hired hands. His mother had passed away the previous winter, and the running of the household had fallen into disorder. His books were a mess. He was a better rancher than an administrator, he admitted without apparent embarrassment, and he needed someone with organizational skills and the willingness to build a life in open country. He was 31 years of age. He did not mention his appearance, which Maggie had assumed meant there was nothing remarkable about it. She had written back with her qualifications, her expectations, and a list of questions about the ranch's finances that had apparently impressed the matrimonial agency's coordinator, who had written to tell Maggie she was quite the most businesslike applicant they had ever handled. Maggie had taken that as a compliment. The arrangement had been agreed upon. Maggie would travel to Coldwater Creek, and they would spend a period of 30 days in a chaperoned arrangement to determine compatibility before any formal decision was made. She had arrived on the afternoon stage, stepped down into the powder-dry main street of Coldwater Creek population, according to the small painted sign at the edge of town, of 342 souls, and walked directly to the general store, which had been named in Clark Haskins's letter as the meeting point. And now she stood here with her ledger and her certainty and her very carefully constructed expectation of a Meek man, looking at someone who was making her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, slightly off balance, which was intolerable. Maggie straightened her spine, smoothed her traveling coat, which was a sensible gray wool and completely inappropriate for the heat, and said, "Shall we go then?" Clark Haskins pushed off from the counter, picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and settled it onto his head with the ease of a man who had performed that particular gesture 10,000 times. "My wagon's out front," he said, "unless you have more bags." "2 trunks," Maggie said. "They are at the stage depot." "I'll get them," he said, and walked past her, and the floorboards barely creaked under him, which struck her as somehow significant, as though the land itself had agreed not to make a fuss about him. Mrs. Phelps, the shopkeeper's wife, who had been pretending to arrange a shelf of tinned goods with tremendous concentration, leaned over to Maggie the moment Clark was out the door and said in a stage whisper, "He is a good man, dear. A very good man. Don't let that face of his scare you." "I am not scared," Maggie said. Mrs. Phelps smiled the kind of smile that meant she did not believe a word of it. "Of course not," she said pleasantly, and went back to her tinned goods. The drive from Coldwater Creek to the Haskins Ranch took 40 minutes, along a rutted road that ran beside the creek for most of its length. The cottonwood trees along the water were enormous and old and threw good shade, and the afternoon light came through them in pieces, falling across the dry grass in patterns that Maggie found herself noticing despite her best efforts to remain focused on practical matters. She asked about the operation. Clark answered her questions without fuss or evasion. 230 head of cattle. A breeding program he had started 3 years ago with a good bull bought at significant cost from a ranch near Pueblo. 20 horses, 4 of which he was training for sale. 2 hired hands, brothers named Pete and Emmett Hollies, who had been with him for 2 years. A smokehouse, a root cellar, a bunkhouse, and a main house that he warned her was functional rather than comfortable. "How functional?" Maggie asked. "I have the basic furnishings," he said. "What my mother kept is still there. Her parlor things, I don't use the parlor." "Why not?" He considered this for a moment. "Not much use for a parlor when it's just me," he said. Maggie made a note in her ledger. She was not sure why she was making a note about the parlor, but it seemed important to write something down. She stole a sideways look at him, He was watching the road with the easy attention of a man whose hands knew what to do without being told. His hat threw a shadow across the upper part of his face, and the line of his jaw was very clean against the late afternoon sky. She looked back at her ledger. "The letter from the agency said your bookkeeping was in disorder," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I know the ranch, the numbers less so. Are you in debt?" He cut her a brief sideways look, and she got the full impact of those gray-blue eyes up close, and she kept her face entirely still through an act of pure will. "No," he said, "not in debt. Just not organized." "I will need to see every record you have within the first 2 days," she said. "Receipts, correspondence, purchase orders, anything you have from the past 3 years. They are in a box on the desk in the study," he said. "All in one box." "Most of them," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite apology and not quite amusement. And Maggie wrote another unnecessary note in her ledger to avoid having to examine how she felt about that combination. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road as the sun was beginning to drop toward the western ridgeline. And even Maggie, who had armed herself thoroughly against being charmed by anything, felt her breath catch briefly at the sight of it. It sat in the curve of the creek, a big old log house with a covered porch running the full length of the front, surrounded by outbuildings that were solid and well-maintained, with a large corral where several horses moved in the golden evening light like pieces of a painting. The mountains behind it were still capped with snow. It was July, but the altitude kept the peaks white, and the whole picture was so perfectly and unfairly beautiful that Maggie felt a spike of irrational irritation at it, as though the landscape itself was conspiring against her defenses. "It is a good property," she said, because that was the only thing she trusted herself to say. "I think so," Clark said quietly. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he loves and has never found words for, and Maggie looked at him looking at it, and felt the dark flower in her chest open another petal. She pressed her lips together and climbed down from the wagon before he could offer to help her. The inside of the house was exactly what he had promised: functional. Clean, she noted with approval, cleaner than she had expected from a bachelor rancher. The floors were swept, the kitchen was orderly if bare, and the parlor, when she pushed open the door, turned out to be a room of unexpected quiet beauty. Her husband to possibly be's mother's furniture, a horsehair sofa and 2 good chairs, a small writing desk, a braided rug in faded blues and greens, and a framed sampler on the wall that read simply "Persevere." Maggie stood in that parlor for a long moment. "What was her name?" she asked. "Your mother." "Ruth," he said from behind her. He was standing in the doorway, not entering, as though the room still held something that required permission. "Ruth Haskins. The sampler was hers. She made it the first winter they were here," he said. "She and my father came out in 1861. I was born here." Maggie turned around and found him watching her with the same steady patience he had shown in the general store, but there was something else in it now, something she could not categorize, a kind of careful attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled. "I will use the parlor," she said. Something shifted in his expression too fast for her to name it. "All right," he said. "It should not be left dark," Maggie said, and she was not sure why she said it, and she turned away before he could respond. They ate supper in the kitchen, a simple meal that Clark produced without ceremony from the leftovers of what turned out to have been a surprisingly competent stew: corn bread, salt beef, beans, strong coffee in mugs that had no handles because the handles had broken off and he had not replaced them. "The agency said 30 days, Maggie said, wrapping both hands around her handleless mug. "Yes," he said, "to determine compatibility." "That is my understanding," he said. He was eating with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to eating alone, but she noticed he had set the table with 2 places and had put the salt and pepper where she could reach them. "I want to be clear about my expectations," Maggie said. He set down his fork and gave her his full attention. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, and she catalogued them with the clinical eye she was using as a shield, and that was working less and less effectively with every passing minute. "Clear away," he said. I am here to assess whether this arrangement is practical and mutually beneficial, she said. I am not a woman who is looking for sentiment or complication. I am looking for a workable partnership. I am good at management and organization, and I can make this ranch run more efficiently than it does. In exchange, I want a home that is mine, a degree of independence that is mine, and the respect of being treated as a capable adult. She watched his face. Men reacted to that speech in a variety of ways: surprise, offense, condescension, negotiation. She had given versions of it before. Clark Haskins looked at her for a moment with those calm, unreadable eyes. Then he said, "That sounds fair, just that. Nothing more." No qualification, no negotiation, no visible struggle with his own ego. Just fair. Maggie did not know what to do with fair. She had been preparing for something to push against. She looked down at her coffee and took a sip and said, "Good." They were quiet for a moment. "The box of records is on the desk," he said. "I moved it to the parlor desk this afternoon if you want to start looking at it tonight." She had not expected that. She had expected to have to ask twice. "That was efficient of you," she said. "You said you wanted to review accounts within 2 days," he said. "Seemed like you meant it." Maggie Whitaker looked at Clark Haskins across a supper table in a lamplight kitchen in the Colorado Territory and felt, with a certainty that alarmed her considerably, that she had badly miscalculated the nature of the challenge she had arrived here to meet. She had come expecting to manage him. He was not manageable, not in the way she had imagined. He was not resistant, not defiant, not the kind of difficult that required confrontation. He was simply, completely, and apparently effortlessly himself, a man who knew his own ground, who heard what was said to him without flinching, who accommodated without submitting and attended without intruding, and who was doing all of this with no apparent awareness that it was having any particular effect on her whatsoever. Which meant he was either the most naturally gifted man she had ever encountered, or he was hiding something. Maggie Whitaker's mother had taught her that every man hid something. She intended to find out what his something was. She spent the first 3 evenings in Ruth Haskins's parlor going through the box of records, and then the second box that turned up under the desk, and then the third, which Clark produced from the study with the air of a man who had forgotten it existed. The records were indeed a disaster: receipts stuffed in without dates, expense entries without categories, a year-old invoice for lumber that had never been reconciled, a contract for the sale of cattle that had terms she found genuinely alarming in their lack of specificity. But underneath the disorder was something interesting. The ranch's fundamental financial position was actually sound, better than sound. Clark Haskins had made good decisions consistently. The breeding program was already producing measurable results. The land was clear. The cattle were healthy. And the 2 hired hands, Pete and Emmett Hollies, were apparently kept on not just for their labor, but because Clark had extended them a modest share agreement that tied their wages partly to the ranch's profitability, which had produced, she looked at the numbers twice to be sure, a genuinely impressive retention of skilled workers at below-market base cost. "Who told you to do the share agreement?" she asked him the morning of the 4th day. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her ledger open and her coffee growing cold because she kept forgetting to drink it. Clark was standing at the stove cooking breakfast with the same easy competence he applied to everything, and he looked over at her. "Nobody told me," he said. "It seemed right. A man works harder when the work is partly his." "It was a good decision," Maggie said. "A very good decision, actually. The labor cost reduction over 2 years comes to," she checked her figures, "approximately $240 while maintaining quality workers. That is not obvious." He turned back to the stove. "Thank you," he said, with no more and no less weight than those 2 words deserved. Maggie looked at her ledger, looked at the back of his head, looked at her ledger again. She had been building a case for his inadequacy, and the evidence was not cooperating. On the 5th day she encountered Pete and Emmett Hollies properly. They were both in their late 20s. sun-darkened and laconic in the way that men who spent most of their time outdoors tended to be, and they treated Clark with a comfortable, unceremonious respect that told her more than any record book could about the nature of his management. They did not defer to him the way men defer to authority they fear. They deferred to him the way men defer to someone they trust, easily, without resentment because they expected the trust to be returned. "He's a fair man," Pete told her when she asked, with the directness she applied to all information gathering. "Never been shorted on wages, never been spoken to like we're less than. Does the work alongside us when it needs doing, doesn't stand back and point." "Does he lose his temper?" Maggie asked. Pete looked at her with a kind of startled respect. "Can't say I've seen it," he said. "Seen him unhappy, seen him tired, never seen him mean." Emmett, sitting against the corral fence and working a piece of harness leather with a needle and thread, added without looking up, "He was real tore up when his mother passed. Didn't miss a day of work, but he was quiet for 2 months after. Real quiet, even for him." Maggie looked at the big log house with its porch and its mountains, and thought about a man being quiet in grief on the land he had been born on, and she felt something that was not in her ledger and could not be entered in her ledger, and that she resented somewhat. She went back inside and made a list of 12 specific improvements she was going to implement in the ranch's administrative systems, and the purposeful act of list-making made her feel better for approximately 4 minutes. On the 6th day, something happened that she had not planned for. She came into the kitchen at dawn, before Clark was up, with the intention of starting the breakfast fire herself and demonstrating that she was as capable of practical work as administrative work. The fire was already going. Clark was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper, writing. He looked up when she came in, startled in a way she had not expected from him. He was, she realized, startled because he had not expected her up so early, not because he had a secret. But the surprise of catching him unguarded, of seeing him without the steady, measured self-possession he wore through every waking moment, was so striking that she stopped in the doorway. His hair was not combed. There was no other way to put it. Clark Haskins, with his hair unkempt in the early morning, with lamplight and coffee and whatever private thought he had been translating onto paper, looked so entirely human and so entirely unlike the controlled, managing presence he was during the day that Maggie felt something inside her chest lurch sideways with a force she was completely unprepared for. She should have stepped back, should have given them both a moment. She stayed in the doorway like an idiot. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "I was going to make breakfast," she said. "Coffee's ready," he said, and stood up and folded the paper in a motion that was not furtive but was very definitely deliberate, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "What are you writing?" she asked, and then was immediately annoyed at herself for asking, because it was none of her business and she had established very clearly that this arrangement was practical and not sentimental, and asking what a man was writing at dawn was not a practical question. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "A letter to the land office. I have been thinking about acquiring the parcel north of the creek. I write things out longhand first to be sure of the reasoning." Maggie blinked. "You think through correspondence in draft before sending it?" "Mostly," he said. "My father used to say a man who writes something down tests whether he actually believes it." "That is," she started and stopped. "What?" he asked. "That is something my mother used to say," she said, "almost exactly." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove popped and shifted. "She sounds like she was a thoughtful woman," Clark said. "She was," Maggie said. "She was the most practical person I have ever known, and the most quietly wise." She did not say what came next, which was that her mother had died 4 years ago, and that the absence of her was still sometimes a hollow in Maggie's chest that surprised her with its sharpness. She did not have to say it. Clark looked at her with those river-calm eyes and nodded once, the way you nod at something you already understand, and then said, "I will fry some eggs," and turned to the stove, and gave her the privacy of not being watched while she composed herself. Which was, Maggie thought, precisely the kind of consideration she had not expected from a man who was supposed to need her management. The revelation of Clark Haskins was accumulating, piece by piece, like evidence at a trial, and the verdict it was building toward was one that Maggie was still refusing to name. On the 8th day, the trap she had been laying for his hidden inadequacy was sprung, but it was not the trap she had intended. She had been systematically reorganizing the ranch's filing system, creating categories and subcategories and a cross-referencing method she was genuinely proud of, and in doing so she found at the back of the second box a stack of letters, personal letters. She recognized them as personal the moment she touched them, from the quality of the paper and the careful way they had been folded, and she set them aside immediately and correctly, because reading a man's personal correspondence without permission was the kind of thing she would never do. But one of the letters had partially unfolded on the desk, and a date caught her eye before she could look away: December 1881, 6 months ago, and above the date in a woman's handwriting a name: your mother. Maggie stared at the partial letter for a moment, then carefully folded it back along its original creases and set it on top of the others, face down. She sat for a long time at the parlor desk, looking out the window at the creek and the cottonwoods in the morning light. Ruth Haskins had written her son letters, and he had kept them in a box with his ranch records, which was either a terrible filing system or the most telling thing she had yet learned about him. She thought it was the second one. At supper she said, "I found some personal letters mixed in with the ranch records. I have set them aside. You should find a different place for them." Clark was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "They were your mother's letters," she said. "I didn't read them." He looked up at her. "I could tell from the handwriting and the date," she said. He nodded. A muscle moved in his jaw. "She wrote me letters when I was up north sometimes," he said. "Working horse sales, she didn't like the telephone, said she could think better in writing." He paused. "She passed in December. Those were the last ones." Maggie set down her fork. "I am sorry," she said. "It has been 7 months," he said, with the kind of even delivery that means a wound is being acknowledged, not healed. "Time is not a reliable measure for grief," Maggie said. Clark looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and a little raw, like a door cracked in a house you had thought was sealed. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." They looked at each other across the supper table, and something passed between them that was not about ranch records or 30-day arrangements or practical partnerships, something warmer and more frightening than any of that, and Maggie was the first to look away. On the 10th day, Clark found her on the porch at dusk. She had taken to sitting on the porch in the evenings after supper, when the heat finally relented, and the mountains went purple against a sky that turned colors she had no proper names for. Not the rose and gold of St. Louis sunsets, which were softer, filtered through river mist and coal smoke, but something fiercer and more absolute, as though the sky out here was allowed to be more itself than city skies were. She was not expecting company. Clark had gone to the barn after supper, as he usually did, to check on a mare that was close to foaling, and she had expected the evening to herself. He came up the porch steps quietly and leaned against the railing, not sitting, just present. She looked at him, he looked at the mountains. They stayed like that for a while, which should have been uncomfortable and was not. "She is not ready yet," he said about the mare. "Is she close?" "Tomorrow, I think," he said. "Or the night." Maggie looked back at the mountains. "Will you sit up with her?" "Probably," he said. "She's a good mare, first foal, worth watching over." The easy affection in his voice when he talked about his animals was something she had begun to look forward to, and that realization was uncomfortable enough that she shifted in her chair and said, "I have been working on the new filing categories. I want to go over them with you tomorrow." "All right," he said. Silence again. The creek murmured. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Maggie felt a tension in her shoulders she could not quite release. "You can ask," she said. "Why did you write to the agency?" She had been waiting for this question, had prepared an answer, and found when she opened her mouth that the prepared answer felt dishonest in a way it had not felt when she rehearsed it in her head. She looked at the darkening mountains and said the true thing instead of the practiced one. "I was tired," she said, "of managing alone, of being competent in a situation that did not value the competence and would not improve. She paused. And I wanted something of my own. Not an employer's household, not a room in my cousin's house, something I built. He was quiet, listening, and the quality of his listening was so complete that it pulled more words out of her than she had intended to give. I told myself I wanted a manageable situation, she said, a household that needed what I had, a man who would appreciate the structure I could bring. And instead you got me, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just accuracy delivered with the same level honesty he brought to everything. Maggie made a sound that was almost a laugh. You are not quite what the letter described, she said. I was honest in the letter, he said. He was not defensive, just clear. I know, she said. The disorder was honest. The rest of you is, she stopped. The rest of me is what? He asked, and his voice was a degree quieter than it had been, and she felt that quietness like a hand placed carefully near hers on the railing. She turned and looked at him full on for the first time since she had arrived, not cataloging, not defending, not building a case, just looking. Clark Haskins looked back at her in the last light of the Colorado evening with an expression that was patient and careful and entirely steady. And underneath the steadiness there was something she recognized, something she had seen in her own mirror on quiet mornings when she let her guard down, the particular loneliness of a person who was capable and present and fundamentally, genuinely alone in the way that has nothing to do with the number of people nearby. Different, she said. The rest of you is very different from what I expected. He nodded as though that was enough and turned back to the mountains, and they sat together on the porch until the stars came out over the Rockies in their hundreds, thick and cold and extraordinary. And Maggie Whitaker, who had come to the Colorado territory to manage a quiet man, sat still and let the stars manage her instead. The mare foaled before dawn, a good strong colt, dark bay with a blaze, which Clark announced at the breakfast table with the contained pleasure of a man who had learned to hold good things carefully. He had been up most of the night, and he was tired in the way that labor makes a person tired, satisfied rather than depleted. Maggie had made the coffee extra strong and had breakfast on the table when he came in from the barn, and she did not examine why she had done this. She simply did it. A colt, he said, and then described the foaling with a quiet precision that was both technically exact and subtly fond, the way he always talked about his animals. And Maggie listened and ate her breakfast and felt the domesticity of the morning settle around her like something entirely new. The 30 days were moving too quickly. She was aware of this without wanting to be. She had brought herself here with a plan: assess, organize, manage, decide. The assessment was revealing a situation far more complex than she had anticipated. The organization was proceeding beautifully. Her new filing system was already transforming the ranch's administrative clarity, and she had identified 3 areas where operating costs could be reduced, and 2 where investment would pay clear dividends. The management question was the problem, because the management was flowing in a direction she had not planned for. She was not managing Clark Haskins. She was managing, with increasing effort, the effect of Clark Haskins on her own equilibrium. On the 14th day, a thing happened that tested both of them in ways she had not foreseen. A man came to the ranch in the early afternoon, arriving on a sweated horse with the kind of urgency that meant trouble. His name was Greer, Thomas Greer, and he was the owner of a smaller spread 3 miles to the south, and his face was the color of old ash when he dismounted in the yard. Maggie was on the porch when he arrived, and she watched Clark come out of the barn and cross the yard in long, unhurried strides, the same deliberate pace he used for everything, but with an alertness in his posture that she was learning to read. Greer talked fast and low, and Maggie could only catch pieces of it from the porch, but the words fire and north pasture and the creeks too low this year came through clear enough, and Clark was already moving before Greer had finished, going back to the barn at a pace that was not quite a run but covered ground with a purpose that made the distinction academic. He came back out leading 2 horses and called up to her, "Miss Whitaker, Greer's pasture fence is down and he has cattle spreading north toward the Johnson property. Johnson is not a patient man about trespass. I need to go help." "I am coming," Maggie said. He looked at her from the yard, both horses in hand, with an expression that was not hesitation and not objection but something between the two. "I can ride," she said flatly, "and you need hands." He looked at her for one more second. "Emmett is already out on the East Range," he said. "Pete is with the horses." He held out the reins of the bay gelding. "He is a good ride, responsive on the left rein." Maggie came down the porch steps and took the reins, and mounted with the practiced ease of a woman who had ridden since childhood. And she saw something flicker across Clark's face, surprise, quick and genuine, followed immediately by something that looked very much like admiration before he turned it away and mounted his own horse. They rode out with Thomas Greer, and the next 4 hours were the most physically demanding Maggie had experienced since she had arrived in Coldwater Creek. Rounding up 36 scattered cattle across unfamiliar range in afternoon heat, helping rebuild a downed section of fence with materials scavenged from what Greer had on hand, negotiating the edgy perimeter of the Johnson property line. She did all of it and more, and she was good at it, adapting quickly to the particular demands of open-range work with the same focused practicality she brought to ledger books. Clark worked beside her without comment, without direction unless she asked for it, without making any of the small, pointed gestures men sometimes made when they were surprised by a woman's competence and could not quite decide whether to be impressed or irritated. He just worked and she just worked, and by the time the fence was repaired and the cattle contained and a sweating, exhausted Thomas Greer had shaken their hands and thanked them from somewhere deep in his relief, the light was going gold and long and Maggie's arms ached in a way that felt honest and good. On the ride back, Clark said, "You ride well." "I told you I could ride," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I should have taken you at your word immediately." A pause. "I apologize for the hesitation." "You hesitated because you thought I might not mean it," she said. "Most people say they can do things they cannot. You had no evidence I was an exception." He looked at her sideways. "That is a generous way to interpret it." "It is an accurate way," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You were more than a hand today, Miss Whitaker. You assessed the situation better than Greer could, and he's been running cattle his whole life. That piece about working the fence from the creek side was right." Maggie was not accustomed to being told she was right. She was accustomed to being right and having it ignored or argued with or appropriated. She did not know quite what to do with being told clearly and without qualification that her judgment had been good. "Thank you," she said. They rode in silence for a while, and it was a different silence from their other ones, warm rather than simply easy, carrying something between them now that had weight and substance, and that she found she did not want to put down. "Clark," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his given name without intending to, and the sound of it in her own mouth surprised her. He looked at her. She said, and then because she was Maggie Whitaker and she did not retreat from things, she said, "I think I have been approaching this arrangement with a premise that was incorrect." "What premise?" he asked. His voice was very careful. "That I was here to make something manageable," she said. "But the ranch is not unmanageable, it is simply unorganized. And you—" She stopped again, and the word she could not say out loud hung in the evening air between them like something living. "I am not what you expected," he said. "No," she said, "you are not." What did you expect? The truth, she thought. Tell him the truth. "I expected a man I could arrange," she said. "A man who would fit into the space I brought with me. Instead I find," she looked at the mountains, the great, indifferent, beautiful mountains, and the words that came were the truest she had said since she arrived. "I find a man who already knows the shape of his own life. And I do not know what to do with that because I have always known what to do." The admission cost her. She felt the cost of it in her sternum. Clark was quiet for a long moment, and they rode, and the horses moved beneath them in the last of the daylight, and then he said, Knowing the shape of your own life doesn't mean there isn't room in it for something new. She looked at him. He was looking ahead at the road, at the ranch coming into sight around the bend in the creek, and his profile was clean and still against the sky, but she could see the careful attention in it, the deliberateness of a man who had chosen his words precisely. "Is that what I am?" she asked. "Something new?" He turned and looked at her then, straight and full and unguarded, and what was in his face was not complicated because it had become simple through being honest, and what it said was the one thing she had not prepared for and the one thing she realized with the slow, total shock of genuine recognition that she had been building toward for 2 weeks without knowing it. "Yes," he said, "and I would like you to stay." Maggie Whitaker had managed difficult things for her entire adult life. She had managed grief and poverty and condescension and loneliness, and the particular sustained effort of being a capable woman in a world that accommodated women's capability only on its own limited terms. She had never once in all of that managing felt that the world was managing her back. She looked at Clark Haskins in the last light of the Colorado evening and felt very clearly, very completely managed. "Let's go in," she said. "The colt will need checking." It was not yes, but it was not no, and from the quiet, satisfied look that settled on Clark Haskins's face as he turned his horse toward the barn, she understood that he heard the difference perfectly well. The following week was the hardest and the best of her life in ways she had not anticipated. She spent her days in the parlor or the kitchen working through the last of the records and building what was becoming a genuinely impressive administrative system for the ranch. She created a monthly ledger format, a categorized expense tracking system, a simplified contract template that she wrote out for Clark to use going forward, and a projection model for the next 2 years based on the breeding program's expected output. Clark reviewed everything she gave him with the same serious attention he brought to all things, asked intelligent questions, and made 2 suggestions about the cattle projection numbers that turned out to be exactly right, because he knew his own animals with a precision that no ledger could entirely capture. She admitted to herself alone in the parlor in the evenings, genuinely enjoying herself. Not just the work, though the work was satisfying in the deep and particular way that good, well-matched work always was, but the shape of the days, the rhythm of the ranch. The way the light moved through the kitchen in the morning, and the way the creek sounded at night through the open window, and the way Clark Haskins appeared at the edge of her awareness with such consistent, unhurried reliability that she had begun, without fully registering it, to organize the day around his presence the way you organize a room around a good window. On the 17th day she found out about the dark past. It did not come from Clark. It came from Mrs. Phelps, who appeared at the ranch in a buggy with a basket of preserved peaches and the combined mission of sociability and reconnaissance, and who sat in Ruth Haskins's parlor and drank tea and told Maggie, with the carefully managed casualness of someone delivering information they consider important, about Eliza Crane. Eliza Crane had been a woman in Coldwater Creek 3 years ago, a widow from back east who had come to the territory the same way Maggie had through a matrimonial arrangement, though not with Clark. She had been engaged to a man named Dorsey who had turned out to be a drinking man with debts and a temper, and she had turned to Clark Haskins for help. For what reason exactly, whether necessity or preference, Mrs. Phelps was delicately vague, and there had been talk, a great deal of talk. Clark had helped her and the talk had grown to include the word involved, and Eliza Crane had ultimately left the territory and gone back east, and Clark had been quiet for a long time after that, and some people said there had been genuine feeling in it, and some people said there had been betrayal, and some people said the most truthful version was probably somewhere between the two. Maggie listened to all of this with her face arranged in the pleasant, attentive expression she had perfected for receiving information. She needed time to process, and she thanked Mrs. Phelps for the peaches, and she walked Mrs. Phelps to her buggy, And then she went back into the parlor and sat down at the desk and looked at the ranch projections in her ledger for quite a long time without seeing any of them. She was not jealous. She cataloged the things she was feeling carefully, clinically, and it was not jealousy. It was something more structural than that. It was the feeling of a plan that has relied on certainty encountering an unknown variable. She had been building something, though she had not named what she was building, and this was a piece of it she had not had, a piece of his past she had not known, and the missing piece changed the picture. It told her that Clark Haskins had been hurt, not the fresh grief of his mother's passing which was visible and present, but an older hurt, the kind that taught you to be careful, and suddenly some of the patience, some of the careful, deliberate self-possession he wore made sense in a new way. He was not naturally restrained in all things. He was restrained because he had learned restraint. He was careful because he had once been less careful and it had cost him. Which meant that the steadiness she had been railing against, the quality of him that she had been interpreting as control, some of it was protection. Not armor exactly, something quieter. The particular stillness of a person who has decided to wait before extending anything irreversible. She was still sitting with this when Clark came in from the barn and she looked up, and he looked at her face and said, with the directness that was one of the things she had come to trust in him most completely, "Mrs. Phelps was here." "Yes," Maggie said. He leaned against the parlor doorframe, the same way he had leaned against the general store counter the day she arrived, and she thought, that is what he does, that is his way of being present without intrusion. He waits at the edge of a room to see if he is wanted inside it. "She told you about Eliza Crane," he said, not a question. "She touched on it," Maggie said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came into the parlor and sat in the chair across from the desk, his hat in his hands, and said, "I can tell you the version that is true if you want it." "I want it," she said. He told her plainly and without self-defense. Eliza Crane had been in a genuinely dangerous situation. The man Dorsey had not just been a drinking man with debts. He had been a man with a violent streak that he kept hidden until it became impossible to hide. She had come to Clark for help getting her belongings out of Dorsey's house and help purchasing a stage ticket and passage back east. Clark had helped her because it was the right thing to do. There had been feeling between them, he said, and he did not apologize for it or minimize it. He had cared for her. But she had not wanted to stay in the territory, and she had not wanted to wait for the particular future Clark represented, and he had let her go without making her reason more than it was. "Were you in love with her?" Maggie asked, and her voice was even because she had decided to ask the hard question directly. Clark looked at his hat for a moment. "I was on my way toward it," he said. "She left before I got there." He looked up. "I am not telling you this as an explanation for something current. I am telling you because you asked and because you deserve a complete picture." "Mrs. Phelps implied there was betrayal," Maggie said. "Dorsey spread that version," Clark said. "A man who wanted to damage her reputation and mine at the same time. He left the territory not long after." He paused. "There was no betrayal. There was me helping a woman in trouble and people deciding it meant something indecent because there was no other story available to them." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she knew of him, the share agreements with his hired hands, the letter to his mother kept in a box with the ranch records, the patience, the steadiness, the way he had told her she was right about the fence line without any of the usual male reluctance. The way he had set the table with 2 places from the very first night quietly, without ceremony, as though it was simply the obvious thing to do. "I believe you," she said. He looked up. "I do not believe it easily," she added. "I am a person who requires evidence before conclusions. The evidence in your particular case is consistent." Something in him released, not visible, nothing dramatic, just a slight settling of the set of his shoulders that told her she had said the right thing and that it had mattered to him more than he would have shown. "Thank you," he said. They were quiet, and the evening settled around them, and the parlor felt lived in, and right in a way it probably had not since Ruth Haskins had been alive to sit in it. And Maggie thought, I have 12 days left of the 30. What am I going to do with them? The answer, she suspected, was the same thing she had been doing, moving inexorably towards something she had come here determined not to need and had found herself needing anyway. On the 20th day, something happened between them that could not be taken back. She was in the kitchen in the late morning, working at the table on the contract template, when she heard a sound from outside that was wrong, not violent, just wrong. The kind of wrongness that a person who has spent time around animals learns to register in the back of the brain without quite hearing it consciously. She got up and went to the window and looked out and saw Clark on the far side of the corral with the bay colt, the one born on the 11th day, now growing fast and increasingly bold. And the colt had spooked at something and Clark was down. Not badly hurt. He was already getting up. She could see the movement, but down. And the colt was backing nervous in the corner of the corral, and something clenched hard in Maggie's chest and propelled her out the door before she had decided to go. She went through the corral gate without breaking stride, went to where Clark was getting himself to his feet with the careful deliberateness of a man assessing damage as he rises, and said, "Are you hurt?" He looked up at her, surprised again, that same genuine unguardedness she had first seen in the kitchen at dawn. "Ribs," he said. "Maybe one. I am fine." "Let me see," she said. He blinked. "Miss Whitaker, Clark," she said. "Let me see." He studied her face for a moment, and then, with a kind of surrender that was nothing like weakness, more like trust, he straightened up and let her approach. She put her hands against his side, carefully, pressing gently in the way she had learned from setting her younger brother's cracked rib when they were children, and her mother had told her exactly what to do. He breathed in sharp through his teeth once and then held still, which told her where the injury was, and she pressed there again with the same careful fingers and said, "There. Not broken, cracked at worst. You need to breathe carefully for a week and not lift heavy things." He looked down at her. She was very close to him. Her hands were still against his ribs, not pressing, just resting, through the fabric of his shirt. She could feel him breathing, slow and steady even through the pain, because of course he breathed slowly and steadily, because of course he did. She was aware, in the particular acute way of very significant moments, of the warmth of him under her palms and the smell of him, horses and leather and plain, clean sweat, and something underneath that was just him. And the colt behind them had stopped its nervous backing and was now making curious approaching moves toward them as horses will. And the mountains stood above the entire situation with their usual impassive grandeur. And Clark Haskins was looking down at her with an expression on his face that had finally, completely, abandoned all its careful restraint. She lifted her face and looked at him. He raised one hand and touched her face, just her cheek, just the back of his fingers, so gently that it should not have felt like the most significant touch she had ever experienced. But it did, because it was offered so entirely, so without reservation, so simply, with all of him present in it. "Maggie," he said, just her name. She had been managing her feelings toward this man for 20 days with all the considerable organizational force of her considerable character, and she was done managing them. She was entirely done. She put her hand over his, the one against her cheek, and held it there and said, "I am not going back to St. Louis." He was very still. "Is that a decision or an announcement?" "Both," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in that way that was not quite a smile but was better than one. "We have 10 days left of the 30, he said. "I know," she said. "I do not need 10 days. He looked at her for a long moment with those storm-sky eyes, and then he said very quietly, "I did not write to the matrimonial agency expecting you either." "What did you expect?" she asked, and the echo of the question he had asked her on the ride back from Greer's place was deliberate, and he heard it, and the almost smile became a real one, which was, she discovered in that moment, the most devastating thing she had yet encountered, because Clark Haskins smiling was not a small or comfortable event. Someone manageable, he said. Maggie Whitaker stood in a corral in the Colorado Territory with a recovering colt nosing her shoulder and a crack-ribbed rancher holding her face, and laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and complete, the kind she had not made in longer than she could name. And Clark Haskins looked at her like she was the best thing he had ever seen in his life, and she believed him. He kissed her 2 days later. Not in the corral, not in the heat of any moment, but on the porch in the evening, deliberately, after a supper where they had talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, the ranch and the land acquisition and the colt and scent. Louis and his mother and her mother, and the way the territory was changing, and the way some things should not change. And he had said good night and stood to go in, and then turned back to her and looked at her for just long enough to let her choose. And she had stood up and met him halfway, which was the only way she had ever done anything important. The kiss was quiet and unhurried and entirely serious, which was exactly right, because the most important things between them had always been quiet and unhurried and entirely serious. And when they separated, she kept her forehead against his chin for a moment, and his arms were around her, and the night air was cool off the mountains, and the stars were doing their usual unreasonable performance above them. "I am going to have to write to the agency," she said, "to inform them the arrangement has reached a conclusion." "And what conclusion will you tell them it has reached?" he asked, and his voice against the top of her head was the low, unhurried river it had always been. "Satisfactory one," she said. His arms tightened. She could feel him breathing carefully because of the ribs, and that made her press a little closer rather than pulling away, because she had already understood it for days, maybe from the beginning, that careful was not the same as afraid. It was the same as honest. Clark Haskins was careful with things he valued. She was a thing he valued. She was going to have to get used to that. The last 8 days of the 30 were not days of assessment. They were days of building. They walked the property line together, all 400 acres, over 2 long days, and Clark showed her the land the way he showed her everything, without performance. Simply and directly. Here is this thing, and here is why it matters. Here is the north pasture where the grass grows best, and here is the cut in the hills where the snow blows through in winter, and here is the place along the creek where the water runs clearest. He answered every question without impatience, and she asked many, and by the end of it she understood the ranch not as a collection of numbers in a ledger, though the ledger was excellent now, the best it had ever been, but as a living thing with its own character and its own needs and its own reliable beauties. She also, in those last 8 days, learned something about Clark Haskins that she had not yet reached, but that completed the picture. He was funny. Not in any loud or performed way. There was nothing loud about him, but in the particular, dry, completely deadpan way of a person who sees the world's absurdities clearly and reports them accurately. He was funny about the colt, who had developed an obsessive fondness for standing directly in doorways and refusing to move. He was funny about Pete and Emmett's ongoing argument about the optimal method for fixing fence posts that had apparently been running continuously for 2 years without resolution. He was funny, gently and without cruelty, about the situation between them, the 30 days and the ledger and the managing. On the 27th day, sitting on the porch in the evening, he said, "You know what the worst part of the box of records was?" "Which part?" she said. "The lumber invoice or the cattle contract?" "Neither," he said. "The cattle contract I knew was bad. The lumber invoice I had forgotten entirely. The worst part was knowing someone was going to open that box and think I was a disaster." "I did think you were a disaster," she said, "for about 4 minutes. Only 4. The underlying financial position was sound," she said. "A truly disastrous man does not make share agreements with his hired hands." He was quiet for a moment. "I hoped it would count in my favor," he said. "It did," she said. She looked at him. "Almost everything about you has counted in your favor, Clark. The only thing that counted against you was not being the man I expected. And the verdict on that particular count." She reached over and put her hand in his, which was by now as natural as breathing. "Acquitted," she said, "unanimously." He turned his hand under hers and held it, and they sat in the evening until the dark came all the way down, and the stars came out in their impossible abundance, and the creek sang, and the mountains stood their watch, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing left to say that they hadn't already said, and some things that had not been said yet but could wait for the right moment. The right moment came on the 29th day. They had ridden out to the north pasture to look at the parcel Clark was considering acquiring, and the land was good. She had looked at it with her practical eye and seen water access and grass quality and the way it connected to the current range, and they had dismounted and stood at the edge of it in the afternoon heat, looking north toward the mountains, and Clark said, "I want to build something here." "On the parcel," she said. "On all of it," he said. He turned and looked at her. "I have been thinking about what you said, about wanting something of your own, something you built. I want you to know I mean that. Not a household to manage, not a man to organize, a partnership. An equal one." Maggie looked at the land and then at him and felt the clarity of a decision that has already been made running through her like clean water. "I know you mean it," she said. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "not as the end of a 30-day arrangement, as a choice." "Clark Haskins," she said, "I made this choice 10 days ago." He stepped toward her and put both hands on either side of her face, gently, the same gentleness he used for everything he valued, and kissed her in the bright afternoon sun of the north pasture with the mountains all around them and the horses grazing indifferently nearby. And it was not quiet and unhurried this time. It was full of everything that had been quietly accumulating for 29 days. All the patience and the care and the dark flower and the shifted axis and the discovery that being managed, when it was done by the right person and for the right reasons, was not loss but something much larger and better than anything she had ever thought to call it. They were married in Coldwater Creek 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in September of 1882, at the town's small Methodist church on the corner of Main Street and Creek Road, with Mrs. Phelps in tears in the front pew and Pete and Emmett Hollies scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good shirts in the second row, and the Reverend Hobbs officiating with the brisk economy of a man who married couples in a territory where people did not stand on ceremony, but liked to get things done right. Maggie wore a dove-gray dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, with her mother's pearl buttons at the collar and cuffs. Clark wore his good dark coat and a white shirt that he had clearly ironed himself, with moderate success. She told him this quietly as they stood before the Reverend, and he murmured back that the collar was the difficult part, and she pressed her lips together to keep from smiling during the vows, which were serious and should not have been funny but were, privately, between them. They said the words and they meant every one of them. The reception was in the churchyard, with the whole of Coldwater Creek's 342 souls in attendance, or at least as many as could make it, with tables of food contributed from a dozen households and a fiddle player named Garrett who was 70 years old and nearly blind and played like a man who had spent his whole life learning one thing, which he had. Clark danced with her, which surprised her. She had not expected him to dance, and he was not graceful exactly, but he was present in it, completely present, the way he was present in all things, and she found that she preferred that to grace. Thomas Greer pumped Clark's hand and told Maggie she had done a good thing coming to this territory. Mrs. Phelps cried some more and then told Maggie she had been worried, just a little worried, when she had first seen the way Maggie had looked at Clark in the general store on the day she arrived, because she had seen that look before and it usually meant either nothing at all or something that could either be wonderful or go very wrong. "Which was it?" Maggie asked. Mrs. Phelps beamed. "Wonderful," she said. "Obviously wonderful." In the months that followed, the Haskins ranch became what both of them had separately imagined, and neither had been able to make alone. Maggie's organizational system transformed the administrative side of the operation into a model that other ranchers in the area began to ask about, quietly, with the careful neutrality of men who want to learn something without appearing to need to. Clark handled these inquiries with his characteristic unhurried directness and told them to ask his wife, who had built it, because she was the one who understood it, and there was never anything in his voice when he said it except factual accuracy and uncomplicated pride. They acquired the north parcel in October, after Maggie reviewed the land office terms with the sharp eye of a woman who had been reading contracts since she was 17, found 3 clauses she did not like, and negotiated them into more equitable language. Clark watched her do this across a table from a land office clerk named Blevins, who had clearly expected the transaction to be straightforward, and felt something so expansive and uncomplicated in his chest that he had to look out the window at the Colorado sky to keep it off his face. The colt, who had been named Buck by Pete and Emmett, and had answered to it immediately, as though he had known all along, grew into an exceptional horse. Clark trained him through the fall with the patient, consistent methodology he applied to all his horses, and by December Buck was the best young animal on the property, and Clark sold him in the spring for twice what the projected price had been, and Maggie put the margin into the breeding fund and wrote the entry in the ledger with neat, satisfied figures. In the evenings they sat on the porch and talked, or were quiet, or walked down to the creek in the last light and stood in the cottonwoods and listened to the water. Clark had begun drafting the North Pasture expansion plan, and he worked on it at the kitchen table in the mornings, and she worked beside him on the account projections, and the house filled with papers and coffee cups and the comfortable, productive noise of 2 people doing important work in the same room, and it was the best sound Maggie had ever known a house to make. She wrote to her cousin Dora in January with a letter that was longer than any she had written since her mother died, and in it she said things she had never expected to say. Things about the territory and the mountains and the particular quality of a winter morning in the Colorado high country when the snow is fresh, and the sky is that specific, absolute blue that you can only see at elevation. Things about the ranch. Things about Clark that were not cataloged or evidence-based but simply true. Dora wrote back that she was sorry she had missed the wedding, and that Maggie sounded different, and that different was not an accusation. Different, Maggie wrote back, is absolutely accurate, and I accept it without defense. On a cold February morning of 1883, with snow on the mountains and ice in the creek and the horses steaming in the corral in the early light, Maggie told Clark she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table, over coffee in the morning, which was where they told each other things that mattered. She said it plainly, without preamble, the way she said everything important, and watched his face. What happened to his face was worth every single thing she had ever done to arrive in that kitchen in that moment. The careful, steady quality he wore through all things went entirely still, and then everything behind it came forward at once: joy that was total and unguarded, relief that was deep and real, and something that looked very much like the particular emotion of a person who had wanted something for a long time and had not, until this moment, let themselves believe in it. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered both her hands with both of his and said, very quietly, Maggie, just her name, again, the same way he had said it in the corral with all of himself in it. In August, she said, I think. August, he repeated, as though placing the word carefully in the right place in the future. The North Pasture will be fenced by July. I can start on the Clark, she said. He stopped. Just for a moment, she said. Just sit here with me for a moment before you start planning the addition. He looked at her. The careful steadiness came back, but warmer now, inhabited by the joy rather than containing it. Yes, he said. All right. They sat together at the kitchen table with their hands joined, and the coffee cooling, and the winter light coming through the window onto the worn wood. And the house was entirely quiet except for the sound of the fire in the stove, and it was the quietest and most complete moment of Maggie Whitaker's life. The baby was a boy, born in the first week of August 1883, when the creek was low and the grass was dry, and the mountains stood very clear and very close in the clean summer air. They named him James, for Clark's father, who had brought Ruth to this land in 1861 and built the first structure on it with his own hands. And Clark held the boy in the hour after his birth with the same careful, total attention he gave to all living things in his keeping. And Maggie watched him from the bed and thought that there was no version of the future she could imagine without this. Without this man, this house, this land, this particular quality of light, this. James was, from the beginning, his father's son in all outward ways, calm, attentive, given to watching things carefully before engaging with them. He also had Maggie's black eyes, which Clark pointed out with quiet satisfaction, and her mother's stubborn jaw, which he pointed out with somewhat less neutrality. Maggie told him that stubbornness in the service of good judgment was a virtue, and Clark told her that on that point he was in complete agreement, and James looked at them both from his cradle, with an expression of serene assessment that made them both laugh in the helpless, uncontained way of new parents in the particular happiness of ordinary life. Pete and Emmett Hollies were officially promoted. Pete to ranch foreman, with a formal title and a formal wage increase that Maggie negotiated, and Clark agreed to with the immediate decisiveness of a man who has already been thinking the same thing. Emmett remained chief stock hand, which he preferred, having no interest in the administrative implications of foreman, and continued his fence-post argument with Pete, which showed no signs of resolution, and had become, by this point, more tradition than dispute. The North Pasture project was completed in the fall of 1883. 210 additional acres, fenced and watered and integrated into the breeding program, and the operations capacity increased accordingly. Maggie updated the projections and found that the numbers said what she had believed when she first looked at the land that afternoon in October the year before. This was going to be a significant expansion. Not dramatic, not risky, but solid. A good decision made by two people who understood the land and the work and each other. She took the updated projections to Clark in the evening, spreading them on the kitchen table between the coffee cups, and went through the numbers point by point, and he listened and asked his questions and made his two corrections with his usual accuracy, and at the end he looked at the full picture and said, "My mother would have liked this." Maggie looked at him. "Tell me something about her," she said. He looked at the projections for a moment and then out the window at the dark mountains and then at the parlor door, which was open the way Maggie kept it. "She came out here at 23, he said. She was from Philadelphia. She had never seen open country like this. My father said she cried the first 3 months, not from grief but from the sheer size of it. He said she said the sky was too big. And then," Maggie said. "And then one morning she stopped talking about Philadelphia," he said. He said he never knew exactly what changed, but one day she looked at the land like it was hers, and from that day it was. He paused. "I think about that sometimes." Maggie was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I stopped talking about St. Louis the day I found the box of letters." He looked at her. "The day I set them aside," she said. "I looked out the parlor window at the creek and the cottonwoods and something happened. I do not have a better word for it. It became mine." Clark looked at her in the lamplight, his wife of 1 year, the mother of his son, the keeper of his books and the co-builder of his life, and the person he had been careful for and not careful enough at the same time, and he said, "I love you, Maggie." He had said it before. He said it with the same quiet consistency he brought to all important things, not rarely, not in performance, but whenever it was true, which was constantly. But it landed every time with the same force as the first time, because it was always specific and present and not a habit but a statement. "I love you," she said. "I loved you before I knew I did," which was deeply inconvenient. He smiled, the real, full smile, the one that was still 2 years in the most devastating thing in her world. "I know," he said. "I could tell." "Could you?" she said. "When?" "The first morning I found you in the doorway," he said. "When you asked what I was writing." She stared at him. That was the 6th day. The 4th, actually, he said. I know because I had been keeping track of how many days before it would be obvious, he said. I was trying to be patient. Maggie looked at her husband for a long moment with the full force of 27 years of competence and management and practical thinking entirely set aside and said, "You are impossible." "Yes, ma'am," he said. By the spring of 1885, the Haskins Ranch was one of the most efficiently run operations in the eastern Colorado Territory, and this was known not only within Coldwater Creek, but in the wider community of ranchers who attended the quarterly cattle market in Pueblo. Clark's breeding program had produced results that other ranchers had begun to discuss with the particular serious interest of men watching a competitor do something right. Maggie attended the Pueblo market with him in April of that year, the first time she had made the trip, and she watched the way men talked to Clark and the way they watched him, and understood that he was regarded as someone genuinely exceptional at what he did, not famous, not given to position or display, but known. The kind of known that comes from consistent excellence and fair dealing over years. She stood beside him at the cattle pens and answered questions about the breeding program's metrics with the fluency of a woman who had spent 3 years studying it from every angle, and she watched 2 separate ranchers nearly visibly recalibrate their expectations of whom they were talking to, and Clark watched them recalibrate, and then looked at her with the private language they had built between them, the slight lift of one eyebrow that meant he had seen exactly what she had seen. She pressed her lips together and turned back to the rancher's question about projected yield per head and answered it very precisely. On the drive home from Pueblo, with James asleep in the back of the wagon between 2 folded blankets and the mountains going gold in the late afternoon, she said, 2 of those men had never spoken to a woman about cattle before. "I know," Clark said. "They will again," she said. "They will," he agreed. "Because the numbers were right," she said. "The numbers were always going to be right," he said. "You built the system." He looked over at her. "But it was not the numbers that surprised them." "No," she said, "it was me." "It was you," he said, "being entirely yourself in a room that was not expecting you." He paused. "I find that one of the better things there is." James stirred in the back and resettled, and the wagon rolled on through the Colorado evening, and Maggie Whitaker, who was Maggie Haskins now and had been for 2.5 years, and found the name still felt like the best kind of accurate, looked at the mountains and the sky and the road ahead, and felt what she had not had a word for when she arrived in this territory but had one for now. Home. Not the house only, though the house was deeply hers by now, with Ruth's parlor and the kitchen table and the porch and the cottonwoods. Not the land only, though the land had become as known to her as her own hand. Home was the accumulated weight of days built well, of work done alongside someone who matched her and challenged her, and saw her with the same steady, serious attention she had been giving to everything since she was 12 years old, managing other people's difficult things, and had never received in return until she stepped off a stagecoach in a powder-dry Main Street and met a man who was not what she expected. Home was Clark sitting beside her on this wagon seat, handling the team with that easy, knowing touch, driving toward the ranch in the evening light. In the autumn of 1885, James Haskins, being 2 years old and deeply verbal and deeply interested in the horses to a degree that Pete and Emmett found professionally affirming, Maggie discovered she was expecting again. She told Clark the same way she had told him the first time, at the kitchen table, in the morning, over coffee, plainly. He responded the same way he had responded the first time, with the total, unguarded joy that was still, each time, something she was unprepared for despite having seen it before. And then he recovered himself and made coffee, and said something practical about the winter stores, and she told him that was a very appropriate response, and he said that he was trying to learn from her example. This baby was born in March of 1886, a girl, pink and furious and loudly opinionated from her first breath, and they named her Ruth, for Clark's mother, and the name settled onto her with an immediacy that suggested it had always been waiting. Ruth was nothing like James in temperament. Where James watched carefully before engaging, Ruth engaged first and reconsidered later, and the household acquired a new and dynamic quality as a result. James regarded his sister with the patient, slightly cautious affection of a person encountering a force of nature they have decided to accept rather than resist, which Clark said privately was the most accurate preview of Ruth Haskins's future he could imagine. With 2 children in the house and the ranch operating at its highest capacity, the days were full in a way that was different from the productive fullness of the early years, more complicated, sometimes more difficult, occasionally very loud, and thoroughly, completely worthwhile. Maggie ran the administrative side of the operation, and the household with the organizational genius that had always been hers, and Clark ran the land and the animals, and the labor with the consistent, present excellence that was his, and they managed all of it together, the way they managed everything, as partners who had been honest with each other from the beginning about what they were capable of and what they needed. On a September evening of 1886, when Ruth was 6 months old and sleeping in the cradle that had been in the house since before Clark was born, and James was down for the night, Clark and Maggie sat on the porch as they had done on hundreds of evenings, and the air was cool off the mountains, and the stars were doing their reliable, extraordinary thing, and the creek sang. She was leaning against him and his arm was around her, and neither of them was talking, because everything had been said and would be said again tomorrow, and there was no need for it in this particular moment. "I wrote to the agency today," she said, "just to say something." He looked down at her. "What for?" "To tell them," she said. "They send a quarterly inquiry. I have been answering it with the minimum required. Today I wrote them a proper reply." She paused. "I told them the arrangement had been eminently satisfactory." She felt his chest move, a low, quiet laugh. "Eminently satisfactory," he said. "That is the phrase you chose." "I thought it was accurate," she said. "You do not think satisfactory undersells it slightly." She tilted her head back and looked at him and found him looking back at her with those eyes, those storm sky, river calm, still devastating eyes, and said, "I also told them that I had arrived expecting a manageable situation and found instead the most unmanageable, complete, and consequential thing I had ever encountered." His arm tightened around her. "Did you send that letter?" "I did," she said. "They are going to use that as an advertisement," he said. "Probably," she said. "I hope it helps someone." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held it there, and she closed her eyes and listened to the creek and the mountains and the ordinary, irreplaceable sound of this life they had built from the improbable, practical, entirely honest foundation of 2 people who had come to each other expecting one thing, and found another thing entirely, something better than expected, better than planned. Built of 30 days and a box of disordered records, and a bay colt in a corral, and a parlor that should not have been left dark, and a letter from a dead mother, kept among the ranch records. Because what else do you do with the things you love best? Something that had started as a transaction and become, like all true things, something that did not need a category because it was exactly and completely itself. Maggie Whitaker had arrived in Coldwater Creek in the summer of 1882, expecting to manage a Meek man, with a leather ledger and a very complete plan and 26 years of competence in perfect working order. What she had found was Clark Haskins, who had managed her as thoroughly and as honestly as anyone ever had or ever would, not by force or authority or the usual instruments of control, but by being so entirely and quietly himself that she had not been able to manage around him, had not been able to keep her careful distance, had not been able to maintain the arranged, efficient, unentangled life she had planned, because a man who is genuinely, completely present in his own life has a gravitational force that reorganization cannot overcome. She had not come here to fall in love. She had come here to build something workable. She had built both, which was, She reflected on the porch in the September evening with her husband's arm around her, and her daughter's cradle through the wall and her son's boots still muddy by the door and 400, and some acres of Colorado territory running under the stars. She had built both, and the two were not in any contradiction, because a good partnership is a love story told in practical terms, and a love story, when it is real, is the most practical thing there is. The mountain stood against the dark, the creek ran on. The stars burned cold and clear above the Haskins ranch, as they had burned before any of them and would burn long after, indifferent and faithful, keeping their eternal watch over the small, irreplaceable lights of ordinary lives lived well. And Clark Haskins held Maggie Haskins on their porch, and she let him hold her, and neither of them needed to say a word about it because they had already said the only word that mattered in 100 different ways over 1,000 different days, and would say it again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as the mountain stood and the creek ran, and the stars did their extraordinary, reliable, unmanageable thing above the high Colorado plain.